Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Putting the Pieces Together, Estimating Pollutant Loads and Managing Best Management Practices. Today we're going to talk about 3 of the modeling options available to MS4s in the Bay Watershed, particularly in the Pennsylvania area. And we're also going to talk a little bit about computing pollutant load reductions from the expert panel documents. I will ask anyone who's listening in on the telephone to please mute your telephones. If you have any questions, we would ask that you hold those till the end. We will have a survey that pops up again after the webinar has ended, and there will be a form in which you can ask those questions, and we will respond to those as a question and answer document following the webcast. At this time, I would like to introduce our presenters. We have Whitney Thomas and Monza DeMera from URS Corporation, and Whitney and Monza, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay. Hi everyone, my name is Whitney Thomas. I'm from URS. I'm a water resources engineer with the URS Germantown office. Monza DeMera is also a water resources engineer with the URS Germantown office. She'll be speaking a little bit later. We've had a focus on municipal stormwater, anything from watershed plans to SWIPs and SPCCs, TMDLs, as well as concept designs. URS has offices worldwide. We've got over 3,000 staff with expertise in the Chesapeake Bay Watershed. We're one of the few companies that has a national water resources practice and has experience in-ground with green infrastructure practices. We also routinely go out and do stream cleanups, as you can see in the picture here. So today we're going to talk about, as Ruth already introduced, just a quick overview of managing BMPs, some site-specific pollutant reduction calculations that you can do to determine how efficient these BMPs will be, as well as we'll go through several opportunities for using water quality modeling methods to determine your planning goals and how efficient they will be. So today we're focusing, this is just an example of some Pennsylvania communities that will have to work together to meet watershed goals. In the previous webinar last week, we talked a little bit about MS4 requirements and some of the regulatory needs in these areas. This webinar is going to be focused more on Pennsylvania areas and Chesapeake Bay, the Chesapeake Bay watershed. As you can tell, watersheds know no political boundaries, so it's going to be important for communities to work together to meet the regulatory goals in these areas. In Pennsylvania, the PADEP has created a draft WIP planning allocations. These are just a few counties that have example target goals. In this area, other counties can refer to the draft WIP for respective allocations. If you're in different areas, you'll have to work with your state regulations to determine what's going on there. I believe DEP used the MapShed model to come up with these allocations, although many other models can be used to come up with goals as well. So I'm going to quickly go through a little bit about a few best management practices that can be used to reduce pollutants in your watershed. We discussed kind of the operation and maintenance of these in a previous webinar. We're going to focus on the nutrient reduction opportunities today. Pennsylvania DEP defines best management practices as a range of opportunities that can be used. BMPs range from agricultural to urban to management types of BMPs, and oftentimes different strategies can be used using a watershed analysis. It's important to evaluate your existing areas for the best BMP in that to be used. Some of the things that you can look at to determine the best BMP are listed here. The criteria to evaluate site-specific a list of criteria. This is a list of criteria to evaluate on a site-specific basis the most suitable BMPs for different areas in your watershed. Today we're focusing on urban BMPs. In Pennsylvania, agricultural BMPs and management practices will also be important, but today we're specifically focusing on urban opportunities. So some of the traditional best management practices that you may see throughout your watershed can include dry ponds, wet ponds, various infiltration techniques, and in general, ponds have a fairly low nutrient reduction rate associated with them, and infiltrations have a little bit higher opportunities to reduce pollutants. Just as a FYI, these reductions are based on the Chesapeake Bay expert panel documents. There may be other documents out there that recommend different reductions based on your specific area. Some other urban practices that can be used are alternative pavements, permeable, pervious, porous pavements, green roofs, bioretention. The list goes on, but in general, these infrastructure practices use a combination of infiltration and uptake to provide nutrient reductions, and they're generally a lot higher than some of the ponds that you would have seen in past decades. Some other urban BMPs that can be used are non-structural or otherwise alternative BMPs. Some of these stretch a little bit more into a planning or regulatory practice, and these can include an outreach as well. Rain barrels, riparian buffers, tree planting, sheet flow to conservation area. These are all items that can be used when the opportunity presents itself to move stormwater flow to an area where there's vegetation to provide some filtering, infiltration, and uptake to provide reductions. These have medium reduction rates compared to some of the other techniques, but they can be a very good method in areas where you may have limited space or limited other opportunities. In many areas throughout the Chesapeake Bay, stream restoration is also used commonly. In the Chesapeake Bay expert panel, there's 3 different methods to estimate nutrient reductions based on the specific type of stream restoration technique. We're not going to get into that today, but if you're curious about that, feel free to check out the CBP expert panel report to determine how you would calculate your nutrient load reductions for this type of strategy. Now we're going to get into some site-specific pollutant reduction calculations. In the CBP panel, the nutrient reduction techniques are going to be are classified as 2 different types. Either new BMPs, such as a new bioretention on the side of a road that didn't previously have any stormwater treatment, or a retrofit, which could be classified as something like a dry pond that's been redesigned to include a sand filter or bioretention cell to provide some water quality treatment as well as detention. New BMP retrofits, again, are generally introduced in areas that didn't previously have stormwater treatment. So a lot of times you'll see this type of situation will be on the side of the road in the road right away, or maybe in a parking lot where the medians were curbs previously. Due to site constraints, putting a retrofit in this area the new retrofit may not meet the new performance standards, but providing any additional water quality treatment will be helpful. This is an example of a new BMP retrofit. For example, you can see that this residential road had a parking area that's getting overgrown with weeds. We've implemented a permeable pavement and bioretention cell, and as you can see, that's now providing water quality treatment as well as volume treatment for an area that would previously have been ponded. So those are new BMP retrofits. Existing BMP retrofits include 3 different classifications: conversions, enhancements, and restorations. The definitions are provided here, and they're pretty self-explanatory. This is an example of a conversion BMP that we did for a client. It was an existing E&S pond that has been left unmaintained for probably 20 years. And our concept design shows an enhancement, or shows a conversion to a filtering practice that would provide water quality and quantity treatment. An example of an enhancement would be adding a forebay to an existing dry pond, and an example of a restoration retrofit BMP would be dredging an existing pond of the sediment that's accumulated over time to meet the original design volume. The CBP provides a fairly simple formula for determining pollutant reduction calculations. You first determine the runoff volume treated based on the storage volume and impervious area, and then you use curves that are provided in the document to determine the pollutant reduction rates. And just a note, I'm going to highlight it, that removal rates in the reporting unit are applied to the entire drainage area, not just impervious area. So that can be a little bit different than some other strategies. The Table 2 in the CBP panel defines BMPs in 2 categories, as you can see here. There's runoff reduction practices and stormwater treatment practices. The majority fall under runoff reduction, and they're primarily based on lower storm events, and the stormwater treatment practices can provide treatment for larger events. The pollutant reduction curves are provided in the CBP panel. There's one for total phosphorus, total nitrogen, and sediment. As stated before, you need to know whether your practice falls under stormwater treatment or runoff retrofit to determine which curve to get your removal rates from. We're going to go through an example. So say, for example, you have an existing parking lot that was built before 1985, and you want to implement a bioretention in the median that is currently curbed. Based on that, you want to determine the amount of runoff treated and the pollutant removal rates that you could potentially get out of this retrofit. To do this, you take the storage volume that you are planning on treating and divide it by the impervious area and convert it to and determine whether or not your practice will be runoff reduction or stormwater treatment. In this case, we're doing a bioretention cell, so that's going to fall under the runoff reduction practices. From there, you'll use the 3 different curves to determine the removal adjuster rates. The removal rates. In this case, the retrofit will provide about 50% reductions for each of the targeted pollutants. There's, for an existing BMP retrofit, that previous example was for a new retrofit, so one that didn't currently have any stormwater treatment. For an existing BMP retrofit, the CBP provides a slightly different way of calculating the removal rates that you'll achieve with the existing versus the new retrofit. For restoration type of designs, it's important to determine whether or not your existing BMP has already been reported to EPA, because you're already, in that case, you would have already been getting credit for the existing BMP. So you'll have to update that based on your planned BMP. So to do this, you're going to determine your existing practice removal rate from Table A5, and it varies based on the type of BMP that you have, as well as the design that it was created for. That's why in some, like for example, in the bioretention cell, you see a variation of efficiency rates. It's based on the different design types that you may have. So as an example, you have a dry extended detention pond and you want to create a submerged gravel wetland that will provide additional storage volume. Again, you want to determine the pollutant removal rates that you could potentially get out of this design. So the first thing you have to do is determine the existing BMP removal rates using the same method as you did for the new retrofit. Oh, I'm sorry. You use the table A5 to determine the efficiency rates based on the type of practice that you currently have, which in this case is a dry extended detention pond, and therefore gets 20% reduction of nitrogen, 20% reduction of phosphorus, and 60% reduction of TSS. Then you want to determine what your new practice will treat. You use the same method as the new site BMP method. So you determine your runoff volume. You determine whether or not your practice is runoff reduction or stormwater treatment. In this case, the gravel wetland will be a stormwater practice. And then you use the adjuster curves to determine the reduction rates. To determine the additional amount of runoff volume treated, you subtract the existing volume treated from the new volume treated. Same thing with the removal rates. And this will provide you with how much more efficient your new retrofit will be from your old BMP. So these site-specific pollutant reductions will be really helpful in determining and prioritizing the BMPs that you want to implement in your jurisdiction. You can use this calculation as well as any other personal goals that you may have to determine what order to implement these BMPs and how to put them into your CIP. And once you've started implementing your BMPs, it's really important to keep track of them. One thing to maintain maintenance so you can continue to get your reductions. It'll also be important for any TMDLs or permits that you may have, which may have their own specific requirements for reporting. The Chesapeake Bay panel, for example, recommends recording and keeping track of these specific items listed on this slide. And there's many different ways in which to track and report these items, but just keep in mind that you will have to keep up with them. And now I'm going to turn it over to Mansa Demira to introduce the water quality modeling methods.
Hello, everybody. I'm Mansa Demira from URS Corporation. So in this part of the webinar, we're going to provide an overview of some water quality models and their general data requirements. So what is a water quality model? Most of the models are usually a combination of mathematical formulae and simulation techniques to predict the concentrations of pollutant loads in a water body. And where are they used? A lot of our clients use water quality models as a part of watershed studies to analyze and compare existing conditions and future conditions so that they can propose suitable BMP alternatives to offset the new loads that would be added to their study area because of any future development. Also, regulatory agencies such as EPA and DEP use them to develop TMDLs for impaired water bodies and to identify potential restoration measures that can help them meet the baseload allocations. So with any model you choose, there's always some general data that's always required. First are your pollutant sources, which can be classified as point sources and non-point sources. Your point sources can include, for example, an industrial facility or maybe a wastewater treatment plant discharging into a stream nearby. And your non-point sources can include varied sources such as either your urban runoff, agricultural runoff, or runoff from livestock areas. Again, depending on the capability of your model, your precipitation data can be input in different formats ranging from either an annual data or to like one single event. So once you've added your sources of pollution and your precipitation data, you when you want to compute the pollutant load reductions that are achieved due to your existing BMP practices that are on the ground, you need to input your BMP info. Again, depending on the capability of your model, this can be done in BMPs can be input in different forms. There are many models out there. This slide actually shows a couple of examples of water quality models and categorizes them based on their complexity. First are your simple models, which are generally used mostly for planning purposes, as they require very minimal effort to put them together. And most of the times they give pollutant loads for an annual basis. Then are your mid-range model. They're a little more detailed than your simple model, and they have actually capability to predict seasonal or interannual pollutant loads. The last category are the detailed models, which definitely require more time and resources to put them together, and they provide more accurate results when compared to the other two kinds of models. Please note that none of these models listed here are either endorsed by CBF or URS, and these are for example purposes only. Also, one thing I'd like to mention that before you choose any model, please make sure you talk to your regulators to ensure that it is one of the approved models. Now, Whitney is going to provide a brief overview about the watershed treatment model.
Hi, everybody. The watershed treatment model is just an example that we're going to show today of a simple method or a simple tool that you can use to estimate how your management techniques will affect your pollutant loads on your streams. It's a spreadsheet-based model that was developed by the Center for Watershed Protection, and there's two available versions. The off-the-shelf version is one where the assumptions are hard-coded. There is a default tab that you can look at, as well as the hidden calculation sheet that contains the background calculations for this version. And the custom version is one where you can see all the assumptions being made at the locations where you're inputting data and change them if you need to. As a note, some of our clients have chosen WTM primarily because it provides a pretty rapid assessment of the pollutant loads on a watershed level. It's great for a planning tool, and it can help quickly determine different types or different plans for the future and how they may relate to your goals. Oh, one more thing. It is free and it's available at the Chesapeake, the Center for Watershed Protection website. So if you want to check it out, it's available there. The WTM is based on the simple method, which is primarily based on volume, pollutant concentration, drainage area, and a conversion factor. This is relatively simple data to obtain and to use. A lot of this information would be available if you have a GIS analysis of the area. So in general, it's a pretty simple model. Again, it's spreadsheet based, so you have 7 tabs for input data and 3 output worksheets. This has been used to assess different suites of management practices to determine which one will be most cost effective in the future. And it's very easy to train and to learn how to use, as well as they have call outs throughout each one of the tabs where you can input data and giving you some help as far as what you need to obtain, how you input it, and any assumptions that you may want to change. So for the primary sources, it's primarily based on the land use in your watershed, so you need to have some sort of overview of how much land is being used in what kind of category. For Pennsylvania, there's Pennsylvania GIS data available on Penn State's website, and there's many other sources for data that you'll need for primary sources, including Soil Data Mart, USGS, NLCD. There's many places to look, so check out your state website, check out some of the other resources available to you if you're looking for this data. This is just a screenshot of what the primary sources worksheet will look like when you open the model. We're using the custom version of the WTM, so those are the screenshots that you'll see in the next few slides. In general, the blue is going to be your input data. Yellow are the assumptions that WTM makes that that you can change based on regional data if you need to, and the gray will be the calculations made based on that. So if you're a curious engineer and you like checking that out and seeing where the calculations are made, this is a great model to be able to see what all is going on. Just as a note, if you have a lot of open water in your watershed, the loads based on this land use are based on the area of open water times the atmospheric deposition, and the WTM assumes the TSS and total phosphorus atmospheric deposition to be based on some studies from Washington, D.C. However, total nitrogen is based on NADP because the D.C. estimates turned out to be about 50% higher than in the Northeast than in the western and southern regions of the U.S. Your secondary sources worksheet will be anything from CSOs, which I know some of the areas in Pennsylvania may have, as well as anything livestock, if you have that in your watershed, road sanding, and any point source dischargers that you might have, which could be listed under the NPDES permit. So again, you'll have to know some data, such as how many houses are using sewage systems, how many sewer overflows you may have each year, as well as the impervious cover that is in both of those sewage sheds. Again, with road sanding, you may have to talk to contractors if you have a contractor doing road sanding, or you need to talk to some of the farmers in the area to determine the number of animals that'll be in the watershed. These are just a few examples of some of the secondary source tables that are available, and it's dependent on the information that you have. So the more information you have, the more accurate your secondary sources are going to be. So just remember that when you're inputting data. So the primary and secondary sources worksheet are the locations where pollutants are going to be coming from. You also want to get credit for the management practices that you already have in place and that are already being used. And these can include items such as street sweeping, using riparian buffers, and pet waste education, anything that you're doing to promote outreach or actively clean and prevent pollutants from getting in the stream. So for the existing practices worksheet, there are you can input anything that you have, including any street sweeping or regulatory type of practices, as well as specific structural stormwater facilities that you may already have in the watershed. If you do have structural facilities, you do need to know the drainage area and the impervious area that they're treating. It's a good GIS practice if you need that. As-built may be another source of information that can help you determine that. Many of these practices have discount factors, and these are essentially a factor that reduces the ideal or studied load reduction to a more realistic in-ground expectation of nutrient reduction. This includes like a capture factor, design factor, and maintenance factor. So examples of this is if you haven't maintained a facility as much as the ideal, or if it was implemented in a limited space. You'll want to reduce the ideal nutrient reduction to a more realistic expectation. So your output table will show you the load reduction that you're getting from your existing practices. This will be helpful in determining how effective your current practices are in your watershed, as well as determining what areas you have to improve on. The estimated pollutant removal efficiencies for your structural practices are similar to the CBP estimates, but they are not exact. So if you're using this method in conjunction with any site-specific reductions as far as planning level purposes go, you may want to modify the WTM pollutant load reductions to match whatever you're using for your site-specific reductions. And finally, you get your existing load output tables, and this will show you the contributions, your source contributions, and the total amount of pollutant loads to your surface waters and groundwaters based on your sources and your existing practices. This will be really helpful in determining where you are now, especially since we've got 2017 and 2025 deadlines through the Chesapeake Bay TMDL. Knowing where you are now will help you determine your plan of attack for the next few years. You can also determine what future management practices you may want to implement and how they will affect your loads to your waters. They can include a variety of things, many of which are listed here. And the tabs in this area follow the same format as the existing practices. In this situation, you do have, it shows you the assumed reductions based on the number of households or the amount of outreach that you may be obtaining. It's based on the media type. For example, in pet waste education, it's based on the media type. You have the opportunity to use anything from newspapers to pamphlets to workshops, and depending on what method that you use to provide outreach, it changes the amount of assumed pollutant reduction that you may contribute to. For any stormwater retrofits that you may be implementing, you will again need the total area that you'll be treating, and it will assume reductions again based on the pollutant reduction estimates in the hidden tab. If you're planning on doing any stream restoration in your watershed, you also have a tab to input the specific site and the length restored, and then you can, it assumes some pollutant removal rates based on the studies that were used to create the WTM model, but you can redefine them based on any region-specific removal rates or methods. There's also a retrofit worksheet that you can go through each practice that you're planning on implementing and see basic site-specific data. Again, the effectiveness can be modified with any region or state-specific removal rates. And once you've determined or input any future plans for what you're going to implement in your watershed, you can see the results on your surface and groundwater loads and see what the effect, how much you're going to reduce total nitrogen, phosphorus, and TSS, or bacteria as well. If you have new development that's going to occur in the future in your watershed, there is an opportunity to implement what is going on and what that effect will be in the watershed. This is an example, and based on what stormwater controls that you'll use with the new development, and that's usually based on whatever regulatory requirements you have in your jurisdiction. It also assumes a discount factor based on that. So as an overview, the WTM is a planning level model, and because of that, it's a very quick assessment There's minimal effort and training required to put the model together, and it accounts for most management practices. Because it's a planning level model, it also provides limitations on what it can be used for. This model is only as good as the information that you put into it, and the assumptions are made on a watershed, entire Chesapeake Bay watershed study area. There's a limitation on the number of pollutants that can be predicted, which is different than some of the more mid-level or detailed models, and a lot of the input data is based on judgment. So because of these challenges, it can be, we found clients to sometimes find it not as accurate as they had hoped it would be. And now I'm going to turn it over to Mansa to go through a mid-range model with you.
So for the mid-range model, we're going to go over Watershed today. This model is developed by Penn State University, and it is an EPA-approved mid-range model. This model is available for free download at the Penn State's website. This webpage also hosts statewide data for the entire Pennsylvania, which can be downloaded and used to build a model for your region. This model has a capability to simulate nutrients, solids, and pathogens, along with runoff. Core simulations of this model are performed using GWLF model, where runoff is estimated using the SES curve number, and sediment yields are calculated using the universal soil loss equation algorithm. The table here provides a list of data that can be input into the model. All this data is in GIS format. As you can see, some of them is required and some of them is optional. So based on the level of detail you want to put your water quality model, you can always add in optional data. So once you click on Watershed, the picture on the left is what you see where you can create your project. And once you have set up your project, the picture on the left is how your interface looks like, where you can load all your input data. This window is where you can load your required data and your optional data. As you can see that you can include your basins, which would be your study area, your land use for the study area, optional information such as, if you have any septic systems information available, you can also include that, or if you have any animal feeding operations info that's available, you can also add into this model. So once you have added all your primary and secondary sources, you can here you can set up your runtime, simulation runtime for your model. After you've added everything, this is the GWLF input parameter window here, where you can set up your simulations, review your input data, and if required, you can even edit it. BMP input for Watershed can be done in two different ways. You can either use the predict tool or the BMP data option available in the GWLFE interface. According to the documentation for this model, it is suggested that the BMP data input available on the GWLF interface has more options than the predict tool, and it has also capability to include urban and rural BMPs. So if you select, if you go ahead and use the BMP data input, here you can see that the two windows where you can input your rural BMPs and your urban BMPs. You also have the capability to edit the efficiencies of BMPs based on if you're using the Chesapeake Bay expert panel report efficiencies, for example, you have the capability to modify the efficiencies based on that. Some of the advantages of this model is since it's the GIS interface that I really like about this model, where you can actually see the study area and visualize it, what you're developing the water quality model for. As I mentioned earlier, for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, data sets are available for the whole state, and they're available for free download, so you can download the data and modify it based on your requirements. Some of the challenges include it's definitely a little more time consuming than your planning level models like WTM. It does not account for all management practices like WTM. I think it has a limitation on the type of BMPs you can model. And it also has a limitation on number of pollutants you can model using it. For the detail model, we're going to go over EPA swim model. This model is also available for free download on the EPA website. And we've provided a link where you can go and check out documentation and download the model and play with it. A great feature about this model is you can conduct hydrologic, hydraulic, and water quality analysis for your study area in one single model. Below, the slide also includes typical applications where this model is generally used. So once you set up this model, this is how the interface looks like. We've highlighted some of the major interface elements in this picture here. I'm going to go over the three major components, the hydrologic, hydraulic, and water quality components of this model, one after another. First is the hydrologic component. For a hydrologic analysis, you can input your precipitation data in three different formats, either as intensity, volume, or cumulative. Your study area are usually represented using subcatchment, where you can input its physical parameters such as land uses, impervious area, slope, etc. If you want to perform a really detailed hydrologic analysis for your study area, you also have the capability to include groundwater and snow information. There are 5 types of LID controls you can add to this model, and they're listed in the slide here. Please note that even though some of these LID controls have pollutant load reduction capabilities, SWIM analyzes only for their hydrologic features only. For the hydraulic component, you have a nodes feature where you can input your hydraulic components such as outfalls to your conveyance system, diversion structures, lakes, etc. SWIM has features to input 24 different types of conduits, in 24 different shapes of conduits, including inputting a capability to include natural cross sections for any streams. So how do we assess pollutant loads in SWIM? Pollutant loads are usually assessed by assigning a pollutant load concentration for each land use type that has pollutant capability. You can assign this by adding build-up and wash-off functions for each land use types for each pollutant. And pollutant load reductions due to the implementation of BMPs can be assigned by adding a node and assigning pollutant load reduction efficiencies to each node. For example, if you want to place a bioretention in your study area, you can add the bioretention using the LID controls available in the hydrologic component and add a node downstream of it and add the pollutant removal efficiency of the bioretention to the node to to perform the same functionality as a bioretention. Some of the advantages, it's definitely provides more accurate results when compared to your simple and mid-range models. And it does not have limitation on the number of pollutants you can model. As you are giving the input data and you are inputting the different types of pollutants you want to model, there's no limitation on that. One of the biggest challenges that I faced with SWIM is the lack of its GIS interface. A lot of times it's more time consuming to convert the GIS's data back and forth between to SWIM format. Another challenge is that this model does not account for all management practices. And definitely more time consuming and does take a lot of time and resources to put a single model together. So we've almost come to the end of this webinar. Looking ahead, make sure you determine your goals either based on your permit or your TMDL requirements. Evaluate potential BMPs that can be implemented in your area to achieve these goals. Estimate the pollutant load reductions that you can achieve by implementing these BMPs and prioritize them so that they can be added to your capital improvements program, and make sure you maintain and track progress of these BMPs in achieving your TMDL goals. This is a list of upcoming events. On April 2nd, there's a Green Infrastructure Program webinar. It's hosted by Forrester University and it's sponsored by URS. On April 3rd, there's an on-site workshop conducted by York County Planning Commission. And with that, we have come to the end of this webinar. We would like to thank CBF and William Penn Foundation for hosting this webinar.
Thank you very much, Mansa and Whitney. At this time, I would like to thank all of our participants for attending in today's webinar. There will be a survey that pops up following this webinar. We would ask that you submit any questions you may have in the comment form on that survey. And subsequent to the ending of this webinar, we will be sending out an email with a link to the recorded webcast as well as your certificates of completion. And that email should be issued within the next week. Again, thank you very much to the folks from URS for presenting today, and thank you to our participants for taking part. Have a great afternoon.